The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Leager, and I'm really fortunate today to have Maya Cantu here. She's the author of American Cinderellas on the Broadway musical stage, imagining the working girl from Irene to Gypsy. And she's also an incoming faculty member at Bennington College. So, Maya, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure, Michael. Thank you so much for having me.
So you write about a number of things in this book, which is a really great read, including the phenomenon of the boss lady. Could you explain what that is and maybe give us a few examples from familiar musicals?
Sure. Yes, the boss lady is kind of the central figure of my chapter 3, which is about boss ladies and enchantresses in musicals of the 40s. Just to set that up a little bit, my book focuses on how Broadway musicals, primarily from the 20s through the 50s, but a little bit before and after too, transformed the Cinderella narrative to address changing roles for women in the workforce. So in the 20s, I sort of look at the form of that in these, Cinderella musicals like Sally and Irene, which were kind of, centered around these immigrant working girls. In the 1930s, on the kind of brassy broads played by Ethel Merman, and on the burlesque stage, Gypsy Rose Lee. And then in the 40s, the figure of the boss lady that you mentioned. And I got that term, which we actually still kind of hear now and then today, from 1941's Lady in the Dark, where the protagonist and title character Liza Elliott, who's a magazine editor at Allure magazine, is called Boss Lady by her love interest, the domineering Charlie Johnson. And Lady in the Dark really is one of the kind of central musicals that is kind of about these sort of battle of the sexes themes that you see so much in the 40s. Kiss Me Kate is another, Annie Get Your Gun. These battle of the sexes themes that also tie in with the sort of taming of the shrew theme. So Charlie calls Eliza, a boss lady, and kind of taunts her throughout in this musical that's sort of, quite problematic in how it depicts I almost said post-war career women, but this musical is from 1941, actually, and so it's just before America entered World War II, but already we're starting to see these themes very heavily.
I was going to say it's ahead of its time, and not necessarily in a good way, in terms of kind of the chronology, right?
Yeah. Well, Lady in the Dark, there are wonderful things about it, starting with Kurt Weill and Ira Gershwin's score. It's one of the all-time great Broadway scores with songs like My Ship and The Saga of Jenny. So it's an absolutely marvelous score, but it doesn't quite hold up to, contemporary, ideas of gender and feminism so much as, the plot is this character, Liza Elliott, going into psychoanalysis to treat her sort of masculinity complex, that she's not a proper woman because she's too absorbed in her career as a fashion editor. And she's sort of portrayed as this sort of austere, this boss lady, career woman who's lacking in glamour. And somehow her romance with Charlie Johnson, her subordinate at the magazine, by submitting to him and ultimately relinquishing her, boss ladiness, only then can she become a proper woman. So it's, plot-wise, narrative-wise, pretty problematic, though I think, an enterprising, smart feminist director today could, do a pretty interesting revival of it.
So like we were saying, that's kind of prefiguring what we're going to be seeing after the war. But right after Lady in the Dark comes along, the United States enters World War II. And that makes for big changes on the home front in terms of gender relations. I was wondering if you could give a little bit of the sort of historical, social context to these musicals that feature the boss lady.
Sure. Well, of course, the major figure of the World War II era is Rosie the Riveter, right? So that's a big theme. And musicals after Lady in the Dark, I'll sometimes celebrate Rosie the Riveter and women, in the workforce. Although this is kind of in the context of women were needed to fill these jobs with men fighting. So, as much as we can say this is, coming out of feminism, it's also coming out of a sense of wartime necessity that women, fill these jobs, not only, in factories, as we commonly think of Rosie the Riveter and all that, but, on the home front. in offices, or fashion offices in the case of Lady in the Dark. So there are musicals like On the Town, which kind of brazenly celebrate career women, and it was wonderfully revived a few years ago with John Rando directing, with wonderfully assertive working women characters. Claire de Lune, originally played by Betty Comden, who of course co-wrote the show with Leonard Bernstein and Adolph Green, and Miss Turnstile's Ivy Smith, and the wonderful Hildy, the aggressive lady cab driver. So there are shows like On the Town that celebrate working women. And then of course after the war, it kind of swings back into more of a sense of conservatism. And there are musicals like Annie Get Your Gun and Kiss Me Kate that are kind of, Kiss Me Kate is of course literally a musical adaptation of Taming of the Shrew, but that's a theme that underlies quite a few of these musicals. And this debate of like, is a woman's place in the workforce, as an independent working woman, or as a wife and mother. So there's this huge debate going on in 40s musicals, and while we might think they're all just pushing women back into the kitchen, it's usually not that simple, and quite a few of these shows do celebrate women in the workforce, and Rosie the Riveter.
And you mentioned that a number of them, On the Town, which you mentioned Betty Comden, a number of other ones, including Kiss Me Kate, are co-written by women.
Absolutely. I think the 40s in many ways was kind of a golden era for women as creative talents in the Broadway musical. Kiss Me Kate was, a lot of that was generated not only by Cole Porter, whose score we love so much, but by Bella Spiewak. She co-wrote the libretto of Kiss Me Kate with her husband, Sam. They were a famous Hollywood screenwriting team before Kiss Me Kate as well. But Bella really kind of took the lead in the backstage framing device and a lot of the kind of early writing. She was actually estranged from Sam when she started writing it with Cole Porter, so she actually took a great deal of the lead in writing Kiss Me Kate. So we had Bella Spiewak, we had Dorothy Fields, who co-wrote the book of Annie Get Your Gun with her brother Herbert, and actually was very involved in sort of the creative genesis of that show as well. And Anita Loos, who we think of her more as maybe a novelist or a screenwriter, but she co-wrote the musical Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, which made such a big star of Carol Channing. So Anita Loos, Betty Comden, writing closely with Adolph Green. They were such a tight unit as a team. Dorothy Fields, and also women like Agnes DeMille, who was the first woman to direct a big Broadway musical with Allegro, but really defined the era with her choreography.
And who also had a pretty interesting sort of biographical background, right, that may have informed some of her work?
Absolutely. I go into that quite a bit in chapter 3. You can say that, she had a big role in the kind of creative direction of many shows she worked on as a choreographer, including, of course, Oklahoma. But there's one show that I really enjoy, One Touch of Venus, that she did the choreography for. That kind of ties into her personal life in some ways. I don't want to read this musical too much as autobiographical. It's a wonderful work of musical comedy about a statue of Venus who comes to life in a museum and kind of has her way with a number of men, particularly a meek barber named Rodney Hatch. But it's very much informed by her marriage to Walter Prude. She was married to a man named Walter Prude. He was a concert manager. And while he loved her very much and she loved him, it wasn't particularly a happy marriage. He was very jealous, frankly, of her career success. She writes about her marriage to Walter Prude extensively in her memoir, and Promenade Home. And he was very jealous. He wanted her to be a little more of a housewife than or a domestic goddess than, she was naturally inclined to be. And she wrote about this kind of frankly tearing her apart, in certain ways. That work was really her identity, and choreography and dance was really her identity. So it created a big conflict in her marriage, as much as she wanted that to work out. So the way this relates to One Touch of Venus is you have a goddess. You have Venus, no less than Venus herself, pressured into a sort of domestic situation and housewifery by the barber. She has this sort of torrid affair with. And, Venus is not going to necessarily want to be tied down to life in ozone heights. It's also kind of a wonderful satire of post-war suburban, return to the countryside movements where, people were moving back to the suburbs. So Venus can't quite see herself in the role of a suburban domestic housewife, and, ends up going back to Mount Olympus at the end. So that kind of ties into some of the personal conflicts that Agnes de Mille had. Although, again, I wouldn't read, it as an autobiography of any sort, but a musical that was very much informed by her life and personal struggles as a woman and as a career woman.
So, given the involvement of people like Comden in directing and choreographing someone like de Mille, does this, to your mind, kind of cause us to reassess musicals in terms of, at least the musicals of this period, in terms of how they relate to issues of feminism, issues of gender?
Yeah, I think there is some cause for reassessment. I think, until maybe fairly recently, there's been an idea that, musicals are about boy-girl romance and sort of more conservative roles for women. And I think, you can certainly find that, the Broadway musical, kind of the golden age structure is built on the boy meets girl plot. But when you look at these shows, like One Touch of Venus or Annie Get Your Gun or Kiss Me Kate or Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, I think, the female characters are assertive, they're brassy, they go after their own goals, maybe as much as, a traditional Prince Charming. There's always some kind of spin on the Cinderella myth in the shows that I write about. But yeah, I think you can both have a more traditional sort of narrative and also quite a bit of feminist content. And I think writers like Betty Comden with Adolph Green and Dorothy Fields really contributed to that. And I also, just should say that, there's been quite a wealth of scholarship in the last few years that look at musical theater from a more feminist perspective. The work of Stacey Wolf has been enormous in that, and quite a few others increasingly. So, I think it is time to reassess, the feminist potential of the Broadway musical. And I think the 40s is really a wonderfully fertile decade for looking at, some of these contradictions that maybe in some ways these shows are, based on conservative models, but they can be subversive or if not subversive, very compatible with feminist ideals. And I think, writers like Betty Comden and Dorothy Fields were certainly actively promoting those.
Now, after the war, so we have these musicals that, as you're saying, are in many ways kind of this golden age for women writing, directing, or collaborating with other people to create these musicals.
Collaboration is important. They're always, going to be collaborating for the most part.
Which is sort of, I guess, inherent to the form of the musical.
Absolutely.
What happens after the war? We sort of, to go back to where we started, you see this already before with Lady in the Dark, but you get this post-war, you write about this sort of post-war surge in kind of more traditional gender relations, or at least the idea that, okay, the war's over, now the women can go back from the factory. You talk about this interesting title. I really don't know what else to say about the title of this book, Modern Woman, The Lost Sex, which comes out in 1947. And ties into this sort of Freudian vogue that comes along. We've seen it already in Lady in the Dark, but Freud becomes this major way to support this idea that women should go back to their traditional role. Can you explain a little bit about what happens there?
Well, Modern Woman, The Lost Sex was certainly a fascinating discovery I made in my research. And it's shocking reading even today, and just how regressive and kind of virulently misogynist this book is. But it does draw on Freudian ideas. I think we have to be careful to distinguish, Freudianism, which has, many different interpretations, and how it was being sort of used and directed in the post-war era in the 1950s. I write about a branch of Freudian thought called ego psychology, which is a factor in Lady in the Dark. And the basic premise of ego psychology is that a woman's place is in the home, that a woman should be guided by her biological destiny as a wife and mother, and that somehow straying too much into the workforce is somehow betraying one's womanhood. And this ego psychology branch of Freudianism, selectively draws from Freud himself, but it's specific to the post-war era, and it was used to kind of preach against women being in the workforce, which, after World War II, women wanted to work. It was tough to get women, back home in the kitchen. And Hollywood too, contributed to sort of sending these messages that your career as a woman is to be a woman. And in a film like All About Eve, as wonderful and brilliant a classic as that is, that's kind of the ultimate message there too. A woman's career is to be a woman. So we do have musicals that are a little more influenced by that. Lady in the Dark early on. I write about Love Life, which is a really innovative and influential early concept musical by Kurt Weill and Alan J. Lerner, but it was actually quite directly influenced by Modern Woman, the Lost Sex, as I found in my research. But in the 50s, you also have shows that critique and satirize Freud. I did find that, consistently throughout the work of Comden and Green in particular, they love to make fun of Freud and these ideas that women are repressed and inhibited. In Wonderful Town, with the character of Ruth Sherwood, or a character like, really lovely sort of, thumbing their nose at some of these Freudian ideas that were coming up in the World War II era.
What about the integrated musical? This is something that is sort of not necessarily directly tied into this, but it's a major, major innovation in the period that these musicals arrive. Could you briefly, maybe for those who don't know, explain what the integrated musical is, but then also sort of explain how it relates to some of the musicals that we've been talking about here and about how women are dealt with in musicals?
Yeah, that's a big question, and it's certainly a question a lot of scholars of musical theater are talking about. What is the integrated musical? And it was certainly a big concept in the World War II and post-World War II era, particularly as guided by Rodgers and Hammerstein with the integrated musical play revolution. That you could say started with Oklahoma, or even started earlier back of Showboat. The sort of benchmarks for integration vary, depending on who you talk to. But the goal was to integrate music, lyrics, direction, choreography, design, every element of the production toward a cohesive narrative that advanced plot and character, using all of these sort of integrated elements. And the way this ties into the role of women is the integrated musical, just to generalize, does tend to sort of rely more on a sense of women in the domestic sphere, more so than women kind of out and about in the workforce, which is a little bit more of a theme of musical comedy, I found. I'm generalizing a bit. There are, certainly integrated musical plays where about working women, and there are musical comedies where woman's place is a domestic one. But, in the shows of Rodgers and Hammerstein and Lerner and Lowe, you do find a little bit more of a domestic influence as far as the woman's place in the narrative. Although, in shows like Oklahoma, Laurie and Aunt Ella are very, headstrong, strong women too. But there's a little bit more of a domestic emphasis, and this is tied to Freud too. The integrated musical was really about, based on the psychology of the characters and expressing the psychology of the characters through the choreography and the dream ballet. The dream ballet was, certainly a huge convention of the musical, not starting with Oklahoma. There were dream ballets well before that. But, of course, Laurie Makes Up Her Mind was such a influential dream ballet. So Freud is really all over the musical of the 40s and the post-war era in many ways. And integration is a part of that.
It's interesting, too, because you write in an earlier chapter about sort of the connections between musical comedy and something like burlesque, which we wouldn't necessarily think of as being, you would think of the integrated musical perhaps as being a little bit more amenable to feminism. Burlesque a little bit more about sort of showing off legs and other body parts. But there seems to be, sort of this weird contradiction where
Mm-hmm.
the more quote unquote respectable integrated musical is actually in some ways more conservative.
Again, I don't want to generalize across the board with that, but I think there's certainly something to that idea, and I think I do kind of get at that a bit in my book. That burlesque goes back to the 19th century and to women like Lydia Thompson and the British Blondes. So there is an idea of like showing off the legs in the female form, but there's also implicit in burlesque an ideal of female subversion, mocking sexual puritanism and the status quo. Kind of brazenly showing off a woman's sexual agency, and a sort of carnivalesque, a sort of mockery of certain cultural pieties and conservatism that I think ties in very well to musical comedy. Although, certainly a lot of musical comedies from the period that I'm covering, don't hold up to 21st century feminist scrutiny so much. But there is often a very brassy, assertive, feminist performance going on in both musical comedy and burlesque, although burlesque is going to, certainly focus on the female form.
So I think to kind of wrap this up, where do we go with, you write about American Cinderellas, but to sort of focus more specifically on the figure of the boss lady, what happens after the 40s once this sort of post-war status quo has been established? Where do we go with figures like Hildy from On the Town?
Well, it depends who's doing, the writing. In a show like My Fair Lady, which is, I don't think anybody could argue that it's not one of the all-time great classics of musical theater. We do get a certain interpretation of Shaw's Pygmalion, where Eliza comes back to Henry Higgins, which, does of course not happen in Pygmalion, where the devil are my slippers. And that's kind of accepted that she's going to bring him his slippers, So that's one example, although Eliza is, again, one of the great characters of musical theater, and, one of the great roles for an actress to play. So, there's some of that, there are, but there are also shows like Wonderful Town, again, by Comden and Green, where you have a figure like Ruth Sherwood, who was actively resisting some of the sort of like 50s feminine mystique. I talk a lot about the feminine mystique in 50s musicals. The book was published in 1963, but the ideas of the feminine mystique and, kind of women as housewives and in the domestic sphere are very kind of pervasive in that. And some musicals affirm it and some, satirize that. Bells Are Ringing is another great Comden and Green show where I talk about the feminine mystique being sort of sent up and quite acerbically critiqued. And I end with Gypsy, really, which is one of the, great feminist musicals in the characters of Rose and Louise, I think. And it, kind of ties up a whole 40 years that I write about of, writers adapting these Cinderella narratives toward, the idea of women in the workforce.
Yeah, and I should clarify that we are talking about one chunk of a much more comprehensive book. You start in, 1919, and like you said, wrap it up 40 years later. So you're covering a lot more territory than just this one type in musicals.
Yeah, but I do go through the evolution, well, not evolution, but the, sort of the changes of these types and the ways in which writers were taking this sort of Cinderella figure and putting her in conversation with women in the workforce. So yes, the boss lady is a big figure in chapter 3, but there's the working girls of the 20s and the broads of the 30s, and the 50s chapter is focused on how Cinderella appears in the guise of the princess and the prostitute. So it's a lot of history I cover, and it's by no means comprehensive in looking at Cinderella narratives in the Broadway musical. They're really all across the history of the form. They're kind of more, you get more cynical Cinderella tales, after the 50s, in shows like Sweet Charity, for instance. Again, Dorothy Fields. Evita is a cynical Cinderella fable, and you get the concept musical, which sort of deconstructs that a bit. So it's really all across the history of the form, but it was really pervasive in the 20s through the 50s, as I found.
So to kind of bring this to the present day, I know you've done a lot of work with dramaturgy with the Mint Theater Company. You've got a fair amount of practical theater experience. And I'm curious, you talked, at the beginning of our conversation about how a feminist director might approach something like Lady in the Dark. Do you have any sort of off-the-cuff thoughts about how we take these musicals and make them work in 2016?
Yeah, well, I would love to see what a director would do now with Lady in the Dark, given how problematic, some of the ideas in it are with gender and psychoanalysis and Freud and all that. But I think that there's 3 dream sequences. The show is based. I didn't even touch upon that, and that's really the central, structuring device of Lady in the Dark is these 3 dreams. So I think something with what if the whole show was the dream of a woman in 2016? I'm not about to direct it anytime soon. It's a huge show. But I would love to see. I would love to see. Not necessarily a female director, but maybe a female director, a director take it on now and see what it has to say about, women in the workforce in 2016 when we're having such vigorous debates about changing roles for women,
Yes, I was going to say, without editorializing too much, the fear of the boss lady figure seems to be rather relevant.
Yes,
Leave it at that. But yeah, that's a really interesting point about bringing these up to 2016. Even something a moment like the spanking in Kiss Me Kate or that final beat of the musical. What the hell do you do with that? So I don't know if you have any sort of final thoughts about how we can make these relate to our present situation.
I do have thoughts on that. I do think musicals are open texts, as a wonderful book by Bruce Curl talks about. They have to relate. They're created out of a certain historical and cultural moment, and they have to relate to the moment in which they're produced. So I do think creative reinterpretations of these shows is certainly welcome. At the same time, they are products of a certain moment in history, and we have to be careful, perhaps, not to put these things these shows into historical context, and realize that maybe something that seems hopelessly retrogressive in 2016 could actually be perceived as feminist or progressive in 1942. So to balance the need for creative reinterpretations or deconstructions, even, because I'd love to see some of these shows deconstructed, with honoring their original historical context. That's kind of where I come at it. But there's a lot of shows in the book that I would love to see revived, on Broadway or elsewhere. Lady in the Dark, One Touch of Venus, Bells Are Ringing has been done recently, but I'd love to see another big Broadway revival of that. I think it's a fabulous show that has a lot to say now.
Well, fingers crossed for a couple of those revivals. Thank you so much, Maya. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael. My pleasure.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.